My watch or almost. Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Bee Ambassador Workshop. I'm delighted to welcome you. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that the land on which I'm on and we are gathering today here in Kelowna is the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation and their peoples. I also want to acknowledge that some of you are joining us from both near and far, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of those lands as well, both past and present. My name is Joan Batorff. I'm a professor in the School of Nursing here at UBC Okanagan and director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention. This is one of our new Embrace Aging events that we're hosting this year. And it's our 8th annual Embrace Aging. It's hard to believe 8 years have gone by. We've been co-hosting this event with the Institute for Healthy Living, Chronic Disease Prevention, Interior Health, and Interior Savings Credit Union. We began this effort to embrace aging to celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging. And as you may have noticed if you've attended some of our events over the month, that we have quite a number of various topics and activities that we've included during the month of March. And really, we've made an effort to design the program for everyone, both young and old, on a variety of topics related to healthy aging to improve everyone's quality of life, both seniors, family caregivers, and really everyone, young and old. So today is one of those sessions that I'm really looking forward to. But before we begin, I just want to let you know that there is a closed captioning box that's probably coming up on your screen. You can move it anywhere you want to on your monitor by just dragging the box. Or if you find it distracting, you can turn it off by hovering at the bottom of your screen. There's a live transcript button, and if you press on that, you can have the transcription disappear. There will be time for questions and comments. I know that, and many of you, I think, will have some comments and questions. So I encourage you to put those into the chat box at really any time during the session, and we'll read them out and have a discussion towards the end. So I'm going to begin by introducing Nancy Holmes, who's Associate Professor in the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies here at UBC Okanagan, who is going to lead this session, and I'll let her introduce our other participants as well. So over to you, Nancy.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan and Jaquetta for organizing this event. Yeah. So I'll just stick up my slide, and that way you'll have the names of the people that I'm just going to briefly mention here. So we're going to be talking about the Bee Ambassador Program. There's me, Nancy Holmes. I'll start off first, and then we're going to have a talk by Mac Repovs, who is a Master of Science student at UBC Okanagan. He's just graduated. He's now actually joining us from Grouse Mountain in Vancouver, where he's working. We'll also be joined afterwards by Jen Garner, who is outside the Laurel building in Kelowna. She works for the Kelowna Museum Society. So I'm gonna do a real quick little intro to the Bee Ambassador Program, and then I will just give you, I'll pass you over to Mac. So some of you may have been to my talk that Jen and I did at the beginning of March, but just a real quick reminder why we're going to focus on bees. This is a headline that came out last year, and I thought it was quite great. It's official. The bee's been declared the most important living being on the planet, and the extinction of bees could mean the end of humanity. Good thing for us to keep in mind, because we are totally and globally dependent on bees. About 90% of flowering plants require an animal pollinator. A lot of that animal pollination is done by bees. In BC, about a third of our birds and mammals are dependent on pollinated fruit and seeds. So it's not just human beings, it's also all the birds and animals that live around us in the woods. And worldwide, pollination, crops that are pollinated are hugely important. And they keep increasing because we like the food that bees pollinate, whether it's strawberries or chocolate. Bees are great pollinators. They're the best pollinators on the planet. Lots of other insects and animals do pollinate, like hummingbirds and bats and beetles and wasps, but only bees are actually made for pollination. They've got body parts that are made for carrying pollen. Some bees carry it under their elbows, some on their legs, some on their hairy bodies, so that makes them perfect for transferring pollen from one plant to another. So real quick facts about wild bees. There are 20,000 species of bees in the world, 900 in Canada, and only one of those bees is the farmed honeybee. The Okanagan Valley is one of the most bee diverse places in the whole of Canada with, well, almost close to 400 species. Most wild bees live and work by themselves, not in hives or big colonies. In other words, they don't have queens, they don't have workers, they don't have drones. Most of these bees do not make honey for us, which is why we probably don't know about them very much. About 70 to 80% of the bees live in the ground, not in hives or in trees, etc. The females do all the work. They lay the eggs, they collect the pollen. The males lounge about after their task is done, which is very similar to honeybees. Only female bees sting, and except for honeybees and bumblebees, very few native bees actually sting. And bees come in many sizes and colors: green, blue, black, orange, etc. Here's a beauty. This is a wild bee. This is the green bee of the Okanagan, Agapostamon. Now, isn't it just gorgeous? It's my favorite bee. So what's the problem with bees? Well, you've probably heard about colony collapse disorder, but in fact, wild bees and insects of all kinds are in trouble. Those of you who are old enough to remember driving in the country back in the 70s and 80s, your windshield would be thick with goop, and every time you stopped to fill up, you'd have to scrape that yellow stuff off your windshield. That just doesn't happen anymore. Up to 75% of flying insects in the northern hemisphere have disappeared in the past 20, 25 years. That's absolutely shocking. It's 8 times faster in extinction rate than any other kind of creature on this planet. George Monbiot coined the term insectageddon for what's happening to us right now. And remember that first slide I showed you about how important they are. Why is this happening? Well, native bees are experiencing all the same things that honeybees are experiencing with colony collapse disorder, mites and diseases and pesticides, but they're also losing their homes. As I say, so many of them live in the ground, but we're paving it over. Climate change is really affecting them, and invasive species competition, and the honeybee is sadly one of them. Habitat creation is one of the number one thing that most ordinary people can do easily. The scientists are busy working on the pesticide and the mites, etc., but we can create homes for bees, places for them to live. And that's where the Bee Ambassador program comes in. And I'll just do a real quick introduction, then pass you over to Mac. The Bee Ambassador program came out of a project that Border Free Bees, a research project at UBC and at Emily Carr University, took on for several years. And we created this program called the Bee Ambassador program. We invited people to commit to a 1 square meter bed of bee-friendly flowers to plant them, choose drought tolerant and pesticide-free plants that bloom hopefully from spring to fall. We asked people to leave bare spots. You can see in the picture here, the little bare spots in the ground for wild bees to dig and nest in, and ideally provide some water for the bees. We asked people to put up a sign so that it'd be visible to the public, and we asked them to tell their neighbors and friends and family what they were doing. So what happened was we got over 300 people in Kelowna signed up to be bee ambassadors between 2018 and 2019. And this is a map of just the mission neighborhood of Kelowna. You can become one too. The program, although it's not officially going in the sense that we don't have a lot of PR going around it, we invite you to go to the website and make the commitment, and you can download a Bee Ambassador sign. And you can get it laminated, or you can actually send it to a printer and get it printed on foam core. So I can talk more about that if you have any questions. So that's what Border Free Bees is all about. And the Bee Ambassador program, it's a fantastic program. And I'm going to hand you over to Mac now. They say he is a graduate student at UBCO, and he's took a look at this Bee Ambassador program and began to ask some questions about it. You know, how is it working? What was it doing? And he's going to share some of that research that he did.
Yeah, so I'll just share my screen and get the presentation up. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. you, how do you share just a portion of the screen?
I don't know if you can just, I think you have, there's actually something there's some button you click in PowerPoint where it says just show the, you just show the slide as opposed to your notes somewhere in PowerPoint.
So not presenter view. Oh yeah, maybe that worked.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That looks good.
Looks good.
Can't hear you now, Mac. You're muted yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Mac Repovs. I'm a former master's student at UBC Okanagan under the supervision of Dr. Jason Pither. And yeah, so I did a study on native bee diversity, specifically within bee ambassador gardens. So I'd just like to share a little bit about that with you. Yeah, so I'll just begin. So kind of as Nancy mentioned, the Okanagan is a very diverse place for many bee species. The Western Interior Basin of southern BC, where the Okanagan sits, actually contains about half of Canada's bee species, about 1/3 of those only occurring within this region. There's over 411 known species to exist and 38 at least native genera, a genus being a closely related grouping of species. But while the Okanagan is one of the most diverse bee hotspots in Canada, the species here may also be some of Canada's most vulnerable due to extreme fragmentation of the valley bottom. So while a fair amount of work has been done to examine native bee diversity within agricultural and natural landscapes of the region, more attention does need to be focused on diversity within urban landscapes. So that's where my study came in. And again, I focused on bee ambassador gardens specifically. So as mentioned, there are more than 350 throughout the city. And a large focus of the Bee Ambassador program is concerned with what actually goes into a garden. So what is planted, the size of the garden, how it's managed, etc. But it doesn't just depend on what you plant in a garden, as even two gardens that are equally as pollinator friendly could be used differently by bees depending on the surrounding landscape. So whether it's in a more agricultural or natural landscape or in a more urban landscape, that'll determine the bee communities that you'll see in those gardens. And so it is important to also consider the landscape effects that can impact these gardens as well. So my study kind of then looked at local and landscape scale characteristics. Both of those can influence how effective a garden actually is in providing urban pollinators with the resources that they need. So local scale characteristics are just associated with the gardens themselves. So the size of the garden, what's planted in it. The landscape characteristics are just associated with the location of a garden within the overall landscape. So for example, the presence of green spaces such as forest fragments surrounding a particular garden habitat. You might see an increase in, species richness, or the number of bee species that you might see in that garden. Whereas if a garden is surrounded by more urban and anthropogenic or human built environment, you might see a decrease in the number of species that you're gonna be able to see in that garden. So overall, more attention needs to be focused on how residential yards can affect pollinator health, and the usage of bee ambassador gardens within this type of study could produce interesting results as well. Many initiatives such as border-free bees provide residents with information on how to create their own pollinator-friendly gardens, but the ability of that type of strategy to actually foster healthy urban bee populations remains yet to be fully understood. So the main objective of my research was kind of to explore how bee communities within Kelowna responded to the the garden characteristics and the landscape characteristics of specifically urban bee ambassador gardens in the city. So how these garden characteristics may have affected the diversity of the bees that we see in these gardens. And to my knowledge, my study is the first to estimate bee diversity within urban gardens within the Okanagan. So we did focus specifically on bee ambassador gardens, and we used 33 of these, which were kindly volunteered by a number of committed ambassadors and were used in the study. We ended up using the results on 32 of those sites in total. And because we were looking at something we were looking at is how urbanized the site was. So we kind of tried to place each site along a gradient of urbanization. So from less urbanized sites to more urbanized. And we did this by looking at the surrounding landscape of each garden and figuring out based on how much road length and building area was in that surrounding landscape would determine whether a site would fall on the lower end and be less urbanized compared to the others, or whether it was a more urbanized site. We also did a lot of field and lab work in the summer of 2019. I had a lot of help from several former colleagues in the biodiversity and landscape ecology research facility at UBC Okanagan, as well. Doctors Jason Pither and Bob Lalonde at UBC were big helps in the development of this project as well. So yeah, so we went out and we went to all the gardens. We visited all 33 of these gardens throughout the summer of 2019. One thing that we wanted to learn was, the characteristics of the garden, the local characteristics. So we measured garden size, the number of different plants, the identity of those plant species, and percent vegetation cover. So the amount of vegetation compared with bare space in a garden. We also actually collected bee specimens physically as well. So what we did was we put out a series of pan traps at each of the gardens. And the pan traps, as you can see in these pictures, there are these bowls that we used, and we filled these with soapy water. And the idea was the surface tension of that soapy water would act to trap and drown any insects that landed in there. And we used yellow, blue, and white as our colors for these traps, and those were shown to be most attractive for bees. We left those out for 48 hours at a time in each garden. And then after the 48 hours, we went back to collect whatever specimens were in there. And it wasn't just bees, there was a lot of other insects that we caught as well. And that occurred 5 times throughout the summer. And then we went back to the lab. We stored all of our specimens in ethanol. So when we were ready to kind of go through them in the lab, we washed them off, and the identification process took several months and afterwards, and we identified those to at least the genus level. So overall, over 1,800 native bee specimens were collected throughout the season across 32 sites, and that spanned 5 different bee families and 18 genera. And then the number of those specimens collected during each of the 5 sampling periods can be seen here as well. So we kind of collected more through the early summer periods, and then it decreased as we went through the summer. The most common by far bees that we collected were sweat bees, or the Halictidae family. And these bees are generally very abundant. And so by far the most abundant genus we collected was Halictus. So this is what they look like here. And fellow sweat bee as Lasioglossum and Agapostemon. So these three genera in particular actually accounted for 2/3 of all the specimens that we collected through the study. So these three here were very dominant in our collections. The next abundant families were Megachilidae. So those are our leaf cutter bees, our hairy belly bees. Mason bees fall into that as well. Our Apidae family, this includes bumblebees, digger bees, among others. Andronidae, which are mining bees, and finally Coletidae, which are polyester bees. And then when we looked at which genera were most common across all sites in terms of the number of sites they appeared at, generally the most abundant overall were also the most commonly observed. So here we have those same three, Halictus, Lasioglossum, Agapostemon, appearing at the top. Those were, no surprise, observed at the most number of sites. Halictus actually appeared at all 32 sites that we used for our results, and Lasioglossum all except one. So again, they were very dominant there. But overall, when we looked at the local and landscape characteristics, we found that increases in, degree of urbanization of a site, or increases in plant diversity or garden size of a particular garden didn't really affect the number of bee genera that we found at a site, or which genera we found at that site very much. So these local landscape factors didn't play a big role in kind of the bee communities that we observed throughout the gardens. And we did also take note of the honeybees throughout the study, being non-native bees. These were pretty common across sites. They appeared at almost all of them and were the 4th most common genus overall. We didn't include these in our main results. Just because they didn't really make an impact on them. And then kind of my secondary objective was to look at the degree to which bee ambassadors were planting recommended pollinator-friendly plants. So among the resources provided by Border Free Bees to the community are a series of lists consisting of a range of non-native and native plant species that are noted as pollinator-friendly and recommended for use in attracting pollinators to a garden. And these are all available on the Border Free Bees site. Pretty extensive plant lists and recommendations. So we wanted to see kind of how the plant species that were actually in a garden overlapped with those that were actually recommended by the program. And we wanted to be able to provide feedback to the administrators of the program. Since becoming a bee ambassador is voluntary, it might be expected that those who were participating would also be keen to follow those recommendations as best as possible. So we just, so I recorded the total number of plant species in the garden, and then the number of species in the garden that were recommended, and then the proportion of the total that was recommended. And a total of 138 recommended plants by Border Free Bees were actually documented. So quite a extensive listing there, most of which being native to the Okanagan. And I found that the kind of average proportion was 47% approximately. So that indicated that on average, just under half of the plant species within a garden, an ambassador garden, would be species that were actually recommended by the Border Free Bees program. But there was a lot of factors affecting that. And there was a lot of variability that we saw in the usage of these recommended plant species, and a lot of good pollinator friendly plants were not listed on those lists either. And there's choices of plants for garden owners might include aesthetics and cost, but based on available evidence, it does remain advisable for those who are planting gardens to make sure that they contain a wide diversity of pollinator friendly plants, just because there are so many different preferences when it comes to bees. And it's important to consider the floral preferences of bees when you are planting a garden. So for example, typically the greater number of species that you're able to accommodate for in your garden, you'll be able to generally support a higher diversity and abundance of native bees if you're using a greater variety of plants, especially native plants. And as mentioned previously, you want to kind of make sure that you're trying to include plants that bloom throughout the season from spring to fall. That'll keep bees coming to your garden throughout the year. So a garden with a lot of variety of plant species that bloom throughout the season is going to generally be able to support a greater abundance and diversity of native bees. Whereas if you have less plant species that don't encompass as wide of a range, generally that would mean most cases lower abilities to support high diversity and abundance. And you want to make sure you're using a lot of colors, but also there are different shape and size preferences for flowers when it comes to bees as well. And this has a lot to do with the tongue length of the bees. So tongue length is normally related to the size of a bee. So long tongue bees are typically larger bees, such as bumblebees or digger bees and many leaf cutters. And these bees can easily forage on a wide range of flowers, from more open flowers that are easier to access or longer tubular flowers that they can reach with their long tongues. So they have a variety of things that they can forage on. And a lot of these are actually specialist bees. So that means that they prefer, many of those maybe prefer to feed on fewer species, maybe deeper throated flower species. Short tongue bees are typically the smaller bees, like the sweat bees, mining bees, etc. And those prefer to feed on more open flowers with easier to access pollen and nectar rewards, instead of the longer, more tubular flowers, for example. Since their tongues are shorter, they won't be able to really forage on those longer flowers. So in general, the best way to allow for or increase the diversity and abundance of native bees in your garden is to accommodate for the preferences of as many bees as possible. Since the floral preferences can vary so much across different families, genera, and species, again, it's important to ensure you have a variety of flower shapes, sizes, colors. Of course, native bees are going to, the best way to attract native bees is with the native plants that they're adapted to feed on. And all of these factors will, of course, have to do with, the resources that you have to put into a garden and, making the best that you can with that. But there are plenty of recommendations and resources that can be found online on the Border Free Bees site. So I recommend checking those out. So kind of to wrap up, so Border Free Bees definitely should aim to further promote the resources in a way that increases visibility, and especially based on what plant species might be most effective in attracting particular families or genera of bees. More efforts to engage a wider diversity of community members, such as a talk like this, additional workshops, hands-on learning opportunities. So things like these that can may act to recruit new MB ambassadors and contribute to the creation of more extensive pollinator habitat networks in the city. So to conclude, my findings add to a growing body of literature, and they do suggest, though, that bee ambassador gardens do provide attractive habitat for native bees. And in focusing my efforts on residential gardens, I did address an additional kind of knowledge gap in understanding how residential yards may affect pollinator health. Overall, 18 of 38 confirmed native genera known to exist in the Western Interior Basin were observed in the studies. So that means that we recorded just under half of the native genera known to exist within this region of BC, which is a pretty good representation. And the study served as a solid base for future research within the Okanagan and for examining an initiative such as the Bee Ambassador Project. Just some acknowledgements. So my supervisory committee, who Nancy was a part of, and she played a huge role in the project as well, and connecting me with the kind, committed Bee Ambassador volunteers who, of course, the study couldn't have happened without. So I'm appreciative of them. As well, my supervisor, Jason Pither, as well as Drs. Bob Lalonde and Lael Parrott, who were also on my supervisory committee, and all of my lab mates who helped out with the project as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for listening. I hope you learned something from that.
Great. Thank you so much, Mac. It was terrific. And I know people probably have lots and lots of questions. I'm just going to.
You want to, should we address some questions now or should we go to Jen?
I think we should probably go to Jen. I was going to just maybe talk about some of the things in the chat, just really quickly before we go to Jen and go back outside. Someone asked about seeds for that are deer resistant. Just a reminder that the native seeds are pretty good. So right now I'm actually running a little project called the Woodhaven Milkweed Project. So you can actually purchase a package of showy milkweed, this gorgeous flower right here, for $5. So feel free to email me and I can put that in the chat later. And then the other thing I just wanted to let you know about is the resources that that we have on Border Free Bees. So you can take a look at our website. On this page that's resources, you can go under gardening tips, and you can find the Okanagan native plants, the Okanagan gardening guide. That's the Okanagan gardening guide is probably the best one here. You can get that list of bee-friendly plants, and we always have put on them how when they bloom and if they're fairly deer resistant. So they're good. They're good. It's a good resource if you want gardening advice. And you can also go become a bee ambassador on this site, and you can download your sign right here in English, French, or Spanish. So there you go. Yeah. So I think, why don't we go to Jen, and then she can tell us what's happening at the museum, and then we can collect some questions and go from there. So Jen Garner.
Okay, thank you very much. And I do want to say those resources from the Border Free Bees site have been invaluable to us at Kelowna Museums. We use those resources for our programming, talks about this garden that I'm going to show you. They've been really fantastic for us. Thank you to Nancy and Mac and everybody who worked so hard adding those resources for us. So I'll tell you a little bit about where I am and what I'm doing outside here today. So I am in the newly renovated Laurel Square, which is a space, it's a public space beside the Laurel Packing House. So here's the Laurel Packing House. I'll tell you just a little bit about this building and the history of it, and of course that strong connection to bees and pollinators. So the Laurel Packing House was built in 1918, and it's one of the original still remaining packing houses in the area. And it was a place where the orchardists brought their fruit, where the fruit was sorted and packed and put into boxes and then sent on the train to the lake. The lake is only about a half a kilometer from here, so it didn't travel too far to get to the lake. But at the lake, the fruit was sent on barges up to Vernon, where it was then put on the railway system. So off to Vancouver, into the prairies and beyond. So This space, and I'm going to give you a few big views of the space so you can see a little bit better of what I'm talking about. It was a horrible gravel pit until about 2 years ago. And for several years, the museum and the city and several different stakeholders and partners have been in deep discussion and collaboration about what to do with this space. And what we have done is basically an extension of the museum, the Orchard Museum, which is inside the Laurel packing house. And huge consideration was put into, what story do we want to tell in this space? Well, we want to tell the story of the orcharding history in the Okanagan, because that's what this space is really about. Where I'm standing now, which is now the cultural district, this was the industrial district for a long, long time, and the industry was all based around orcharding. So it was all based around the packing houses, the canneries, the cold storages. So we knew we wanted to tell the story of the orcharding industry. We also wanted to tell the deep and long history of the Syilx Okanagan people on this land. And we also, of course, because orcharding and bees and pollinators are so closely related, we wanted to tell the pollinator story. So we had a lot of really big themes to work with. So let me see here. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to switch my screen. I'm going to show you a couple of features, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the garden and some of the features specifically in the garden. So what I'm going to do, here we go. So you can see we've got a little teaser of the garden space here. It's actually quite big. We have over here it's kind of a play area that looks like the old orcharding boxes and bins. And there's all kinds of neat stuff here, like different photos of the orcharding industry in the Laurel packing house. Here we have the Laurel packing house itself. And then way back over in the corner, we have a shunting truck, which was used to bring the rail cars when they were full of packed fruit, to drag them along the rails to the lake. So there's the shunting truck. We also have an irrigation display right here. So there's a couple of the big features of the Laurel Square that I'm in. So now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about the garden. So when we planted this garden, it was actually just planted in the fall of 2020. So it's a very new garden. There was a lot of consideration and conversation about what we were going to put in this garden. And what we're focusing on are indigenous plants, drought-tolerant plants, and pollinator-friendly plants. And of course, when we started putting plants in those three lists, most of them overlap. So a lot of the plants actually fall into all three of those categories. Now, because it's March, there's not a ton of color and bloom. I'm going to show you a couple of our early blooms. But I did bring a few dried plant samples to show you of things that we will see in the garden in the upcoming months. So my first sample here to show you is sumac. So this is a drupe from the sumac tree. And actually the sumac tree in the garden has been here for years. And so we were able to keep that tree and plant around it, which is great. So these drupes, I'll give you, I have a bit of indigenous knowledge on some of these plants here in the garden. So the Syilx people use these drupes and make a drink. It's called Sumac Aid. So kind of makes you think of a sort of cool summery drink, sometimes mixed with something sweet like strawberries or raspberries. So that is a treat for the kids out of the sumac. Also in this garden, we have Saskatoon berries. So here's the dried sample. Ooh, it's a little windy. Trying to get a good focus on there. So dried, they do look like tiny little dried blueberries, but these are Saskatoon berries. So they are an indigenous plant here, an important plant to the Syilx people as well. The Saskatoon berries represent the spring. So after, and we look at traditional times of the Syilx people, after a long winter of eating dried and smoked food, the Saskatoon berries were the fresh food of the spring. And it was time for, it was a reason to celebrate and have a festival. It's called the Sia Festival. Sia is the indigenous word for Saskatoon berry. And that Sia festival still happens today. And finally, here my third dry sample, and we have tons of this that's going to come up in the garden. This is Oregon grape. So here I've got, so we can see the leaf. It's as beautiful in the spring and the summer. It's a beautiful green, waxy leaf. It kind of looks like holly. And then in the fall, it goes a beautiful red color. And you do any hiking or even walking through neighborhoods in the Okanagan, you're gonna see Oregon grape. And this sample, we've actually peeled away some of the bark, and underneath the bark, it's bright yellow. It looks like turmeric. And that is traditionally used as dye. And I wanted to show you, I actually printed off a picture here. Here's a photograph that we took. In the jar there, you can see the shavings of the inside of the Oregon grape. A beautiful bright yellow color. Okay, all right, let's go into the garden and have a look. Okay, oh, I'm trying to switch my screen here. Here we go, okay. So I'm gonna give you a little span. So there's Ellis Street. And it goes all the way to what connects to the Rotary Center. And this garden has dozens of varieties of species. As I said, they're a mixture of indigenous, drought tolerant, and pollinator friendly species. And there are over 2,000 plants planted in this garden. Now I want to show you a couple of the signs. So we are trying to make this a very interpretive space. So in the garden, everything's going to be labeled. So there we've got wild rose, hawthorn. So we have these beautiful signs that are going to tell our visitors what all of these different plants are. Now here we've got something that many of you might recognize. We've got lamb's ear. There's lots of this here. So easy to know what it's named for. It's an incredibly soft leaf. Learning from indigenous friends, let's call it camping toilet paper in a pinch if you needed it. And now here we are at our insect hotel. So this is a really prominent feature in the Laurel Square. Let me get back far enough so you can see it. It's so beautiful. It's so cool. This insect hotel was built, it was constructed in collaboration with Men's Shed. They helped us design it and build it and put it together. And so the insect hotel is filled with all kinds of fantastic crevices and tubes and holes and organic matter that insects are going to love to make their homes in. We've got the mesh covering it for protection from birds and from people, as we are, of course, downtown. So we've got this beautiful insect hotel. And the idea with putting an insect hotel here is giving our wonderful insects this fantastic place to live, but then of course, providing them with the food that they need. So we need all kinds of pollinator plants to feed our hotel guests. And so that's why we have it right on the edge of our garden. And I see, I'm going to come right in here. I just noticed this morning, even though it's a bit of a cold day, we have some of our first blooms coming up. I don't know what this is. I haven't had a chance to investigate, but there's these beautiful teeny tiny little flowers that are starting to pop up. And the more I look, they're actually everywhere. So some of our early flowers. Now, some of the things that you're going to see in this garden as it starts to grow and we start to warm up a little bit here. Some lavender. So we know the pollinators love lavender. Brown-eyed Susans. Showy aster. Got a couple more to show you here. Yarrow, an indigenous plant here. Really good for pollinators as well. And I'll show you one more. Nodding onion, another indigenous plant here. So for anybody who is near downtown and said in a couple more weeks maybe, please come and visit the Laurel Square and check out what's happening in the garden. And we'll keep checking in on our insect hotel because we do hope that we'll have some hotel guests, some little pollinating insects and bees join us at the insect hotel very soon. And I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll stick around for questions if anybody has questions.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you, Jen, for this tour. It makes me want to come down and have a look. And Nancy, for your intro and answers to questions, and also Max for telling us about your study. And it does look like we have some questions. I know that Nancy answered a few of the questions already. There were some questions about deer-resistant plants. And I don't know, Jen, if the plants that you have in your garden, would you think that some of those are deer resistant? I know the lavender is for sure, because I have it in my garden and it thrives because the deer don't eat it. So lavender, I know for sure.
Yeah, there are a lot of deer resistant plants, and I'd have to go check the list to tell you exactly what they are. Nancy might know more, because I know that list on the Border Free Bees talks a little bit about it. But we do get deer walking right down the street, so it was definitely a consideration.
Yeah. Nancy, did you want to add anything? I know you directed people to the Border Free website. Did you want to comment about any of those particular plants that are in the garden downtown?
Well, I think that the native plants are the ones that are deer resistant. I mean, you never can say they're proof because deer will eat everything, right? If they're hungry. But I think things like the yarrow and the showy aster and the sumac, those will all be very deer resistant. They don't eat them out in the woods, right? The yarrow is blooming, and also a blanket flower like the gaillardia and things like some of the native plants that we associate with being outside in our particular woods. They've evolved to be resistant to the deer.
Yes,
so
exactly.
The deer fatten themselves on our tulips and our roses and all those, wonderful flowers that we import from elsewhere. Yeah,
that's right. Our garden is their salad bowl. So that's great. And that's good advice around thinking about native plants, and those might be a first clue for getting something that's deer resistant. Someone asked if the Laurel garden is irrigated.
Yes, it is. There's drip irrigation all underneath it. And they're planning to do more irrigation for the first couple of years as the garden is getting established, because it is a new garden. It said it was only planted this past fall. And then once the plants are more established, they'll be able to use less irrigation. Because of course the plants that were chosen, they won't need as much irrigation, as if we filled it with tulips or something like that.
Yeah.
So in a couple years to get them fully established.
Right, because they're all drought resistant, so they should be pretty much okay once they get established.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Unfortunately, Mac's laptop battery died, so that's why he's not joining us right on at the moment, but he is on call. If anyone has a special question for him, Jaquetta has his number, so we can get him on conference call. So that's funny. So yeah, so he probably has to go back to work too.
Yeah, he starts. I was going to add something to Mac's presentation. One of the things that we all thought was really fascinating about his research was, he had the 3 color bowls, the white bowl, the blue bowl, and the yellow bowl. And we asked him which one caught the most bees, like which one was the color they liked the best. And by far, it was the yellow.
Really?
Oh, there he is.
Wow.
He's back, it looks like.
Oh, he's back.
Yeah. Yeah, so bees love yellow. I mean, they love blue and purple and white, but oh my goodness, they were crazy about the yellow.
Oh yeah, so that's interesting. And the Oregon grape has a yellow flower, so there's a start. Oh yeah, so I see Mac is here, so that's great. And he says, yes, yellow was the most common by far at every site. It was a very popular color for our bees in the Okanagan. So that's really something to keep in mind. That's great. I encourage other people, if you have any comments or questions, to pop them in the question or comment box. I guess my challenge is thinking about flowers that will last through, or that bloom throughout the year. I've got lots of spring ones, because we do have lots of spring ones in the Okanagan anyway, with all of our Saskatoons, our Okanagan sunflowers, and the Oregon grape. They all bloom about the same time. And so there's this massive color in the Okanagan in the spring. But not so many wildflowers later on. And so it's interesting to think about what to put in your garden later on that might be good for the bees. So that late summer, early fall. Any suggestions there?
Well, a lot of those summer plants, like the yarrow is a good summer bloomer, and the blanket flower, that blooms from June till the fall.
Yeah.
And then there are some other little native flowers that people don't notice very much. Like there's this one called snow buckthorn that blooms in August. And so there actually are some, but they're not quite as showy, perhaps,
Right.
as those wonderful spring flowers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the reason it's important is that bees, like bumblebees, they forage from early spring right until the very end of fall. So it's really good to keep them, keep flowers that you do. And you don't have to always just have the native flowers. You could plant sunflowers. Bees love sunflowers, right?
Yeah.
And they're late summer bloomers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So if people don't have a garden space, if you had some mixed flower baskets on your deck or on your back step, or maybe hanging from on your front step, are those attractive to the bees? Do they like those too?
I think one of the things that's really important about Mac's research is that showed that, the bees will come if the flowers are there. It doesn't even matter what's around them. So if it's, a very urban site, sure, I think planting baskets and pots is great, And again, the bees are not super crazy about the things that we normally plant in pots, like petunias and geranium. They're not crazy about those, but they would love a pot of lavender, and they would love herbs. Like they love herbs like thyme and basil and oregano. Like if you plant those in pots, they'll just be crazy about it.
Mhm. And Nancy asked, how about vegetable varieties? Do some of the vegetables that bloom have flowers? Are those helpful?
Oh yeah, for sure they are. Yeah, they especially like, I mean, there maybe you have to have a commitment to let some of your vegetables go to seed. You know, like the parsley or something. They love parsley, like any of those little tiny flowers, the little tiny bees like, because some bees are only as small as like fruit flies.
Mm.
So little tiny flowers like if you let your parsley go to seed, or you let your lettuce go to seed, or your dill go to seed, they will really like those.
Yeah, that's great. Great.
Savory, yeah.
Yeah, someone says that they love my savory.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, herbs are great, and they're great for your balcony too, right?
Yeah.
You use them too. So
Yeah, nice and handy. Absolutely. Erica asks, how do you deter cats using garden boxes as litter boxes? Any native plants or flowers that could help deter cats but attract bees? Now that's a tricky one.
That's a hard one. Yeah. I think you can go to Art Nap or one of those garden centers, and you can get sort of cat, you know, repellent sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nita says, I'm really worried about the abundance of bees if we are. So I guess worrying about attracting too many bees, should we be worried about that?
Well, I think that, you know, as I noted, most native bees don't sting.
Yeah.
So you probably don't even notice. Like, again, Mac's research shows that you probably have like 40 or 50 different species of bees in your backyard right now, if you've got a decent garden. So how many of those times have you been stung? Like, you have not been stung by 40 or 50 different kinds of bees, right? You just have not.
No.
Maybe you've been stung by a wasp, maybe you've been stung by a honeybee. But chances are the more bees, the better for everyone around you, for your garden, for all the orchards that are around you. Like it's so important to have those species. So I don't think we need to worry about the numbers of bees or abundance of bees, really. We should be really happy if we have an abundance of bees, right?
Right.
You're doing your bit for the planet.
Yeah,
you know.
that's right. That's right. There is this question, and I think this is a hard one too. Sometimes it's hard to tell between wasps and bees and tell them apart. And we know that the wasps come out in August and are quite annoying and can bite. So is there an easy way to tell the difference other than waiting till you're bitten?
Yeah. Well, Jan has a little program that she does that she just tells you how to tell apart the bees, the flies, and the wasps.
Oh,
right?
Jen, you can maybe answer that question. You have any quick tips?
I should have brought the game along because we designed it to work over Zoom. We look at some of the easiest features to be able to spot, I'm going to say on the fly, whether or not you're seeing a bee, a fly, or a wasp. And you know, one of the easier ones is if the body is fuzzy, then it's a bee. And if the body is a bit more sleek, and as Nancy says, the supermodel waist, the skinny waist, then it's a wasp. So a couple of simple things, but I know when you're outside and trying to shoo away something as you're eating your dinner, it's pretty hard to tell some of those features.
Yeah. So this is a good question because I think many of us put up these wasp traps that you can buy in the hardware store so that we're not annoyed by those wasps in August. And the question is, are bees attracted to those wasp traps? Are we interfering with the bees, or are we only catching the wasps?
It's a good question, and I don't actually know how attractive the bees find the wasp traps, but I guess our big message in Border Free Bees is always all insects are important. And you know, wasps are also really good pollinators, and they do so. They're sort of like the you know, they're like the garbage men of the insect world, that they go and eat all kinds of rotten matter and they eat other insects. And so they're really important, even though we don't like them very much. So I think it's best to not kill wasps, to tell you the truth. And doing things really early, like starting about now or in the next few weeks, putting up those fake wasp nests around your patio where you eat in August is a good way of kind of getting the wasps sort of away from your eating spaces. And you don't want wasps by your front door. You don't want them by where you eat. So you do have to be careful of those things. But I think, exactly, wasps eat your aphids. So they're really important in the system. And I think just keep in mind that incredible statistic about how 75% of our flying insects have disappeared in the Northern Hemisphere. That's terrible. That includes wasps. And it's partly to do with not just the poisons that we use, but also the mental poison. We think insects are so awful and ugly and we should kill them all the time. And I think, getting kids and young people and ourselves to start caring for insects it's hard, especially when it's wasps and hornets. But
exactly.
but finding other ways of keeping wasps away is I think a good thing to do.
That's a good suggestion. I see we've run out of time already, but this has really been fabulous. And it's got us all motivated to think about our gardens and how to protect all these insects around us. So, and we're all, of course, looking forward to the spring flowers, including the bees. So I do want to thank you, Nancy, Jen, and Max, for spending your time with us this afternoon and sharing this very valuable information about how to be bee ambassadors. And for those of you who joined us today, I also want to really thank you for joining us. The first 20 people that registered will be sending you out a package of seeds that hopefully you can plant or share with a neighbor to plant. And if you are interested in finding out more about the men's shed that built that wonderful insect hotel, on Saturday, there's an open house, an Embrace Aging event for the men's shed and also Helen's Acres. So you can check that out on our website. And it is an outdoor event, but COVID protocols will be followed. But there'll be tours of Helen's gardens, and they'll tell everyone what they've been up to. I'm looking forward to that. And also there'll be limited tours of the men's shed, but they'll have many things outside as well. So do think about joining us on Saturday. It looks like it's going to be a sunny day. And so we'll look forward to seeing some of you there. And there's still a few more other events before the end of March. So again, we encourage you to check those out and join us again. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us today and spending time with us. Bye for now.